Tonight, the moon hangs low over a city built on blood and gold, a jewel so blindingly powerful that its very existence was an insult to the gods of the Mediterranean. Can you believe the sheer, unbelievable audacity of this place? Carthage. Say the name out loud. It echoes with the grinding sound of triremes slicing through waves, and the chilling silence of sacrificial fires burning under a cloak of night. This wasn't just a city. It was the undisputed master of the ancient world's oceans, a financial titan whose shadow stretched from the pillars of Hercules to the shores of Egypt. They had fleets so vast they could blot out the sun, and treasury vaults so deep they redefined the meaning of obscene wealth. But beneath that shimmering facade of incredible prosperity, beneath the marble temples and the incredible, almost alien engineering of their harbor, lurked a darkness that history still struggles to confront. This is the story of a civilization that achieved near immortality through commerce, only to be dragged into the deepest abyss by the crushing weight of its own unparalleled ambition. We are going back, way back, to the moment before the ultimate catastrophe, to the time when Carthage believed it was untouchable, when the whisper of Rome was still just a distant, irritating noise, like a mosquito buzzing far across the sea. Imagine standing on the ramparts tonight, the salt spray cooling your face, looking out at the circular military harbor, a masterpiece of paranoia and power, where 220 warships lay perfectly coiled, ready to strike any enemy, anywhere, instantly. This harbor was their secret weapon, completely hidden from outsiders, a fortress within a fortress, designed by minds centuries ahead of their time. But the terrifying truth is this: for all their military genius, for all their unimaginable wealth, and for all the gods they relentlessly tried to appease, they missed the real threat. A catastrophe no one saw coming was already in motion, fueled not by superior technology or smarter generals, but by a sheer, relentless, barbaric will to survive that Carthage simply could not comprehend. The air itself feels heavy with history tonight, steeped in the scent of spices and the faint metallic tang of copper, the coinage that made them kings. The Phoenicians, the founders of this colossal empire, were the ultimate entrepreneurs. They didn't conquer with armies first, they conquered with contracts. They were the original shadow rulers, creating global supply chains before the concept even had a name. They sailed beyond the known world, navigating by stars that no Greek or Roman dared to follow, bringing back silver from Spain, tin from Britain, and ivory from the deepest parts of Africa. They were the middlemen of destiny, and their profit margins were astronomical. But with power comes a terrible price, and the price of Carthaginian dominance was paid not just in silver ingots, but in silence, secrecy, and the heartbreaking screams that echoed from the Tophet. Yes, we have to talk about the Tophet. Can you believe they had a dedicated burial ground, a sacred, terrifying place where the remains of thousands of infants and young children were discovered? This is where the story turns from thrilling history to absolute horror. The historians argue fiercely, was it necessary sacrifice to the god Baal Hamon, or simply a burial ground for stillbirths? Tonight, under the moonlight, the ruins whisper the truth. The line between devotion and absolute terror was razor thin in this society. They were willing to trade the most precious thing they had, perhaps even their own offspring, for military victory or commercial success. This duality, extreme sophistication, paired with ancient bloody dread, is what makes Carthage so compelling, and ultimately, so tragic. Their generals were brilliant. Men like Hamilcar Barca, and later, his legendary son, Hannibal. These were not just soldiers. They were embodiments of pure, unrelenting hatred for the rising power across the strait, Rome. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, made his son swear an oath that would fundamentally reshape the entire Western world. Imagine the scene: a young boy, barely 9 years old, standing before the altar of Baal, his hand raised, vowing eternal, unyielding hostility to Rome. It's the kind of cinematic moment that Hollywood couldn't even invent. This oath wasn't just a political strategy. It was a curse. It ensured that the conflict between these two superpowers would be total, existential, and utterly merciless. Rome and Carthage could not coexist. One had to fall. And history, cold and uncompromising, decided which city would become dust. The first two Punic Wars were mere warm-ups, brutal skirmishes that tested the limits of endurance. But the Third Punic War, that was an execution. It was a 50-year-long vendetta culminating in a siege so terrible, so agonizingly protracted, that when the Romans finally broke through, they turned Carthage into a monument of ash and salt. We will walk through the narrow, high-rise streets of this metropolis tonight, feeling the ghosts of the 1,000,000 people who once lived here, hearing the clatter of bronze and the arguments of merchants trading ivory tusks for Cypriot wine. We will witness the terrifying moment Dido, the legendary queen, first saw the shores of Africa and decided to build not just a city, but a dynasty that would challenge the nascent power of the entire European continent. Get ready, because the true, terrifying story of ancient Carthage by moonlight is far darker, far richer, and far more violent than any textbook ever dared to tell you.
They told you it was a powerful city, but they never told you it was the city where gold flowed like the rivers of paradise, and the air itself smelled of exotic spices and maritime dominance. We are not talking about a simple port.
Under the pale, watchful North African moon, the massive triple lines of the Theodosian walls didn't just stand, they towered, an arrogant declaration of invincibility to the entire Mediterranean world. Inside, the noise of the Magan Quarter, the heart of commerce, was a constant, deafening hymn to the almighty denarius. This was not a kingdom ruled by a frantic warring king, but a calculated, cold-blooded republic of merchants, guided by the shadowy hands of the wealthiest families, the true masters of the sea. Their ships, the magnificent Punic galleys, were faster, sturdier, and more numerous than anyone else's fleet combined, ensuring that every shipment, every trade route, bent to the will of the Carthaginian oligarchs. The city's structure was a masterpiece of logistical brutality. The circular Cathon, the inner harbor, was not just a place for docking. It was a fortress, concealing 220 warship sheds, each protected by a secret wall and overseen by the admiral's headquarters, a perfect, hidden engine of naval supremacy. You couldn't even see the military might until you were already inside the trap. The two Sophates, the annually elected magistrates, held power not through brute force, but through the balance sheets and the massive land holdings that stretched deep into the fertile African hinterland. Think of them as the CEOs of the greatest global corporation the ancient world had ever conceived. Men whose authority was rooted in profit margins, not divine right. But the true origin of this staggering power traces back centuries, an epic born of fire and betrayal. The flight of Princess Elissa, later known to history as Dido, from the treacherous streets of Tyre. She brought with her the ancient Phoenician fire, the drive to trade, to explore, and to dominate every single shipping lane with ruthless efficiency.
Her legendary founding act, cutting the oxhide into thin, impossibly long strips to secure the land for the citadel, the Bursa, was not a charming myth. It was the foundational contract. It stated clearly, Carthaginian ingenuity would always find a way to maximize every inch, every resource, and every transaction, bending the very laws of geometry to their will.
The Bursa itself, perched atop the hill, was more than a citadel. It was the sacred, high-security vault where the city's destiny was calculated and guarded. Below its imposing shadow, the Senate met, a council dominated by the rich, making decisions that dictated the price of silver in Spain and the supply of grain in Sicily. Carthage didn't need a massive standing citizen army constantly draining its treasury and distracting its best minds from making money. Why fight your own battles when you could buy the best, most brutal fighters the world had to offer? They developed the ultimate strategy of outsourced violence. Iberians wielding terrifying falcatas, ferocious Gauls from the north who fought naked in freezing cold, swift Numidian cavalry that struck like desert vipers, and disciplined Greek hoplites fighting for the highest bidder, This was the Carthaginian war machine, a kaleidoscope of paid professional killers, led by Punic officers. This mercenary structure was the engine of their commercial success, freeing citizens to focus on trade and governance, making them exponentially richer. But it held a terrifying, fatal flaw. Loyalty bought with silver is loyalty that can be unbought by more silver, or crushed by sheer, desperate refusal of payment. And now we must talk about the silence, the chilling, profound silence that lay at the edges of their bustling metropolis, hidden under the same pale moonlight that illuminated their magnificent harbors. The Tophet, the sacred ground dedicated to the dark, demanding gods Baal Hamon and Tanit. This is where the historical debate burns hottest, but the archaeological evidence, grim and undeniable, tells a story of terrifying, ritualistic devotion that echoes through history like a scream. Thousands upon thousands of stelae, markers indicating urns, filled with the calcined remains of infants and small children. The sheer scale of this sacrificial ground whispers of a terrifying commitment to appease cosmic powers during moments of existential dread and profound crisis. Was it only stillborn infants, or was it ritual, dedicated sacrifice of the firstborn in times of famine, plague, or war? A horrifying insurance policy paid to keep the vast empire afloat. Historians argue over the exact nuance, but the visual, the massive field of tiny, scorched graves, is enough to chill the blood of a modern man to ice. This was the dark underbelly of Carthaginian pragmatism, absolute ruthlessness in business, and absolute, terrifying devotion to their gods when the ledger books seemed to fail. They would pay any price, human or monetary, to retain their dominion. But as Carthage perfected its model of global dominance, accumulating wealth and sacrificing to keep the gods quiet, a monster was stirring in the east, across the narrow straits of Sicily, a growing headache that would soon metastasize into terminal cancer. A rough, violent, unsophisticated republic, built not on trade or inherited wealth, but on iron discipline, agricultural expansion, and a terrifying, unwavering belief in the supremacy of the Roman citizen soldier. They knew how to suffer, and they knew how to rebuild. Rome saw the wealth of Carthage not as something to trade with, but as something to seize and subjugate entirely. Carthage, in its gilded arrogance, saw Rome as a crude upstart, a barbarian who knew how to fight, but didn't know how to count, who lacked the sophistication to truly run a global enterprise. This mutual, fatal misunderstanding was the powder keg that was about to detonate, centered on the strategic choke point of Sicily. They were two titans destined to occupy the same small, vital space, the Mediterranean Sea, which the Carthaginians arrogantly called Mare Nostrum, our sea. Rome was about to teach them a brutal lesson in naming rights, fueled by an ancient oath of vengeance that stretched back to the mythological founding of both cities, demanding eternal, unending conflict until one was utterly erased. Carthage thought its impenetrable ships and its endless flow of gold made it invincible. Rome was preparing to prove that the true strength of an empire is not how much you pay your soldiers, but how much they believe in the dirt they fight for. And that difference, my friends, would soon cost Carthage everything, ushering in the blood-soaked century of the Punic Wars. The blood-soaked century was already staining the horizon, not with the red of a desert sunset, but with the inevitable crimson of iron and fury. Because when two titans grow too large for the same sandbox, the sandbox itself becomes the funeral pyre. Carthage, the queen of the sea, believed her dominion was absolute, that the waves were her shield, and her fleet the unconquerable teeth of the great Phoenician shark. They never truly grasped the terrifying, maniacal ambition of the agrarian beast rising across the water, the one that didn't just want profit, but demanded absolute, soul-crushing supremacy. Rome didn't fight for trade routes or tariffs. Rome fought because she believed the world owed her reverence, and Carthage was simply standing in the way of destiny. This clash was not about commerce. It was about incompatible wills, a destiny written in different ancient languages. The Punic tongue spoke of wealth and efficiency. The Latin tongue screamed of eternal duty and imperium. The first true tremor, the seismic event that shattered the fragile peace, struck in the critical, shimmering jewel known as Sicily. This island was the dagger aimed straight at the heart of both empires, the central fortress that controlled the maritime highway. A group of ruthless Italian mercenaries, the Mamertines, the Sons of Mars, had seized the strategic port city of Messana. When they were cornered, desperately facing down the powerful Syracusan army, they did the unthinkable. They sent out two simultaneous SOS signals. One plea sailed east, seeking the protection of Carthage, who instantly saw the tactical advantage of controlling that strait. The other plea rode furiously north, begging for the terrifying intervention of Rome. Carthage acted first, moving with the practiced efficiency of 1,000 years of naval dominance, occupying the citadel and planting the Punic banner. They were certain this move was checkmate, a subtle flexing of power that Rome would respect. But you must understand something crucial about the Romans. They had an unholy hunger for land and a deep historical paranoia about any non-Italian power settling so close to their boot heel. The Senate debated, torn between the massive risk of engaging the world's greatest navy and the terrifying prospect of a Carthaginian base just miles from the Italian mainland. In the end, avarice won, cloaked, as always, in the noble language of protecting Roman allies. Consul Appius Claudius Caudex took the unimaginable risk, crossing the strait in leaky ships, throwing down the gauntlet, and effectively starting the 23-year-long, agonizing First Punic War.
Carthage had not just miscalculated. They had fundamentally misunderstood the beast they were prodding. Their initial reaction was one of supreme arrogance and scorn. Why would these land-hugging farmers dare challenge the heirs of Tyre, the masters of the deep?
For years, the conflict was a predictable nightmare for Rome on the water. Carthage's triremes and quinqueremes were faster, their sailors more skilled, their tactics honed by centuries of fighting the Greeks. The Punic navy treated the Mediterranean not as a battleground, but as their personal, highly profitable lake. The Romans, meanwhile, were masters of the terrestrial murder machine, the legion, the most efficient land army the world had ever seen. But on the sea, they were simply farmers and cobblers in glorified rowboats. The Carthaginians laughed, a deep, satisfied, aristocratic laugh that echoed across the waves. They called the Romans clumsy, landlocked barbarians who would drown before they ever threatened the great harbor of Byrsa. But Rome, that terrifying engine of adaptation, did the impossible. They looked at a wrecked Carthaginian warship that had washed ashore, studied its design like a blueprint for world domination, and in a terrifying burst of national will, they reverse-engineered it. Within mere months, they launched a fleet of 100 quinqueremes, an industrial mobilization so sudden and vast that it defied every expectation of ancient warfare. It was a staggering feat, fueled not by mercenary gold, but by the sheer, terrifying necessity of survival and the sacred Roman oath of duty. And then came the invention that would rewrite naval history, a weapon of brutal simplicity, designed to turn a sea battle into a land battle. The corvus. The corvus, the Raven, was a massive, spiked boarding bridge slammed down onto the deck of an enemy ship. It eliminated the necessity of complicated naval maneuvering and the generations of sailing skill required to win a fight at sea. Instead of delicate ramming and skillful sailing, the Roman legionaries just locked the ships together, screamed their war cries, and poured across the bridge like a tidal wave of steel. They transformed the Punic deck into a floating extension of the Italian peninsula, forcing the Carthaginian sailors to fight the brutal, close-quarters hack and slash of the Roman sword, a type of fighting they were neither trained for nor expecting. The psychological horror of the corvus was immense. Carthage was winning on paper, but Rome was winning the technological and psychological war. And what, ultimately, were they fighting for? They were fighting for the keys to the Mediterranean bank vault. For Carthage was not just a city. It was the financial nexus of the ancient world, the ultimate golden prize. Imagine a metropolis where every street corner shimmered with the silver brought in from Iberian mines, where warehouses were stacked so high with textiles, exotic animals, and luxury goods that the sky seemed blocked out. This wealth was their strength, but it was also the colossal magnet, drawing the envious gaze of Rome. Every sack of grain lost, every ship sunk, every tribute demanded, hit the Carthaginian treasury harder than 1,000 Roman spears, because unlike Rome, Carthage had to pay for its blood, and the cost of maintaining the greatest empire of the sea was astronomical, a constant, crushing burden that would eventually buckle under the strain of prolonged war. The strain was unbearable, the financial and spiritual burden of maintaining the vast Carthaginian network threatening to tear the fabric of the city itself. But the weight of gold and the stench of burning offerings hung heavy in the air. The true catalyst for disaster was the simple, brutal reality of geography. They controlled the waves, yes, but their Achilles' heel, the geographic dagger pointed directly at the heart of their empire, was the magnificent island of Sicily. It was a treasure trove of grain, a crucial strategic choke point, and now it was about to become the blood-soaked stage for the greatest rivalry the world had ever known, an explosion of violence that would shatter the known order. Carthage looked at Sicily as its birthright, an extension of its commercial domain, vital for Punic control of the western trade routes. But the Romans, whose empire was still consolidating its grip over the Italian peninsula, looked at the same island with a terrifying mixture of predatory hunger and profound, paralyzing fear. They saw the Carthaginian presence not as a commercial interest, but as an existential threat, staring them down across the narrow Strait of Messina. The spark that ignited the catastrophic Punic Wars was not a grand diplomatic insult or a clash of emperors. It was the chaotic action of a brutal gang of mercenaries. These men were the Mamertines, the sons of Mars, a desperate and vicious band of Italian thugs who had seized control of the vital Sicilian port city of Messina after brutally murdering its inhabitants. When the Syracusan tyrant Hiero II cornered them, the Mamertines did the unforgivable. They called for help from both sides, inviting the lion and the shark to the same bloody feast. Carthage, acting on generations of maritime doctrine, rushed in first, placing a powerful garrison within Messina, believing their established naval dominance granted them immediate, unquestioned sovereignty over the strait. This was the moment the Carthaginian Sophites miscalculated the Roman spirit. The Senate in Rome, driven by a horrifying combination of ambition, greed, and a deep-seated historical suspicion of Phoenician power, saw Carthage's move not as a defense of local interests, but as a direct, unacceptable encroachment upon the sacred soil of Italia. The idea of Carthaginian quinqueremes dominating that narrow passage, just a stone's throw from the Roman boot, triggered an immediate collective panic in the forum. They understood with chilling clarity that if Carthage solidified its hold on Sicily, the very future of the burgeoning Roman Republic would be choked off before it even had a chance to breathe. This was not a war of choice. In the fevered minds of the Roman consuls, desperate for military glory and terrified of the ancient Phoenician shadow, it was a war of absolute survival. They were willing to bankrupt the Republic and sacrifice entire generations just to push the Punic menace back into the sea. Carthage, meanwhile, remained tragically and fatally overconfident. Blinded by centuries of easy commercial dominance, they scoffed at the rising power of the landlubbers across the strait. They saw Rome as merely a collection of tough, provincial farmers, excellent marchers and fearsome infantry perhaps, but certainly not sailors.
Why fear an opponent whose entire infrastructure was geared toward agriculture and legions, when your own power rested on the unassailable might of the Mediterranean fleet, the technological marvel of the ancient world? They possessed the Punic ships, the swift, deadly triremes and quinqueremes, perfected over generations of maritime mastery, crewed by sailors who navigated by instinct, the stars, and the smell of salt. They believed the sea itself was their fortress, their birthright, and their insurmountable defense. This arrogance, this profound strategic blind spot, would become the single greatest factor in their eventual ruin. While the Carthaginian Senate debated the price of tin from Britain and the logistics of the silver mines in Spain, Rome was busy doing the impossible. They were building a navy from scratch. Not just a few hastily constructed transports, but a massive, battle-ready fleet, based entirely on reverse engineering a captured Carthaginian warship that had somehow foundered on their shores. It was a colossal effort, a testament to Roman efficiency and brute force determination that defied all logical maritime history. Legend whispers that the Romans dismantled the captured Punic ship plank by plank, using it as the blueprint for an entire armada and trading their legions to row on dry land. Imagine the sight. Thousands of hardened legionaries practicing nautical warfare in dusty fields outside Ostia, mimicking the motion until their arms bled, preparing their bodies for a battle they were entirely unprepared to fight conventionally. But the true genius, the strategic madness that changed the course of the war, was the development of the corvus. The Romans knew they could never outsail, outturn, or outmaneuver the Punic masters on the open waves. So they decided, in a stroke of breathtaking audacity, to eliminate naval warfare altogether. The corvus, the Raven, was a massive, pivoting boarding bridge, equipped with a heavy iron spike, a deadly beak that would slam down with crushing force, piercing the enemy ship's deck and locking the two vessels inextricably fast. It instantly neutralized Carthage's primary advantage, turning a sophisticated, high-speed naval battle into a crude, desperate land skirmish. It forced the elite Carthaginian marines to fight the disciplined, overwhelming mass of the Roman legions on an unsteady, floating platform. The Carthaginian admirals looked at the corvus and saw a cumbersome, awkward liability. The Romans looked at it and saw a guaranteed victory device, a weapon that translated their strength on land directly onto the unforgiving sea. Carthage saw the rising fleet and scoffed at the inferior craftsmanship. Rome saw the corvus and tasted Phoenician blood. The declaration of war in 264 BC was not a sudden burst of anger. It was the inevitable, cataclysmic collision of two entirely separate worlds, separated by a thin strait, each believing the other was the cancer that must be excised for their own survival. The ancient oath,
sworn on the blood of Dido's ancestors, had come due. The debt of history was now payable in unimaginable quantities of blood, and the Mediterranean was about to run red with the sacrifices of two mighty empires, locked in a struggle that would span a century and leave only one standing. The Punic Wars had begun, heralded by the clanging metal of the Corvus and the silent, cold judgment of the Carthaginian moon. The sea, that vast sapphire highway built by generations of Carthaginian genius, suddenly turned into a drowning pool of Carthaginian blood. The unthinkable was happening. Rome, the landlubber, the peasant state that had only just learned which end of a boat faced forward, was defying the mistress of the waves, and they were doing it with shocking, brutal efficiency. It was all down to one monstrous, terrible device, a piece of engineering so crude yet so effective it shattered the foundation of naval warfare forever. The Corvus, the Raven, a dark, terrifying boarding bridge armed with a massive iron spike, designed not to outsail the enemy, but to lock on to them like a vulture sinking its talons into prey. Carthage's admirals, men whose lineage stretched back to the very origins of Tyre, had perfected the art of naval maneuvering, the swift ramming, the rapid retreat, the elegant dance of the trireme. But when the Corvus dropped, the dance ended. Rome didn't want a sea battle. They wanted a land invasion on a splintering deck. The elegant naval tactics of the Carthaginians were instantly nullified. A sea fight became a bloody melee, a brutal infantry clash where the Roman legionary, the most optimized killing machine the ancient world had yet produced, held all the advantage. The scream of the Corvus's spike driving into Carthaginian cedar was the death knell of centuries of maritime supremacy. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, the shock was total. Rome, fielding its first major fleet, utterly routed the Carthaginian armada. Imagine the sheer disbelief in the halls of the Sophites, the stunned silence of the merchant princes who believed their gold and their fleets made them untouchable. Rome was not playing by the rules of civilized warfare. They were rewriting the very script of conquest in iron. The Great Sicilian Campaign became a brutal, grinding meat grinder, a cycle of siege and counter-siege, where the stakes were not just territory, but the very soul of the Mediterranean. Carthage poured endless gold into mercenary armies, hiring the best fighting men from Iberia, Gaul, and Greece, believing money could buy destiny. Rome, however, relied on the relentless engine of its citizen soldiers, men who fought not for pay, but for the sacred soil of their republic. This was the fundamental, tragic flaw of the Carthaginian strategy. They outsourced their fate, while Rome embodied its own. The war escalated to unimaginable heights. The Battle of Cape Ecnomus, 256 BC, was arguably the largest naval engagement the world had ever seen, involving over 300 ships on each side. a floating city of war carrying nearly 300,000 men into battle. The sea itself turned viscous and red beneath the collision of wood and the drowning cries of thousands. It was a battle waged not just by men, but by sheer industrial-scale shipbuilding. Rome, despite massive losses, demonstrated an almost terrifying ability to rebuild its entire fleet, often within months, like a hydra regenerating its heads. Carthage was rich, but Rome was inexhaustible. But the ultimate horror came later that same year. Having defeated Carthage at sea, the audacious, almost mad Romans dared the unthinkable. They launched an invasion force, landing on the shores of Africa itself. Marcus Atilius Regulus, a man whose name would forever haunt Carthaginian memory, marched his legions within sight of the gleaming white walls of Carthage. Panic gripped the city like a suffocating shroud. The citizens, used to the comfort of their vast wealth and the protection of the sea, were suddenly faced with the prospect of Roman steel in their own streets. The Tophet, the silent, terrible place of sacrifice, must have seemed cold comfort now against the reality of the Roman threat. The Sophetes, desperate, turned to the only solution they knew: more gold, better mercenaries. They hired a Spartan general, a man named Xanthippus, whose military acumen was legendary, a brilliant mind in a city drowning in its own commercial hubris. Xanthippus looked at the broken Carthaginian army and saw not defeat, but opportunity. He immediately reorganized their forces, emphasizing the terrifying power of their war elephants, beasts Carthage had often neglected in favor of naval power. Regulus, drunk on his own success and believing the Carthaginian spirit was broken, walked straight into Xanthippus's trap. The Battle of Tunis in 255 BC was a stunning reversal of fortune. Xanthippus used his elephants like living tanks, shattering the Roman lines, and the Carthaginian cavalry, finally deployed effectively, rode down the fleeing legionaries. Regulus himself was captured, a massive propaganda victory, and his army was utterly destroyed. The immediate threat was averted. The Roman legions were swept from African soil, and the merchant princes breathed a collective, shuddering sigh of relief. Yet this victory was merely a pause, a brief, bloody intermission in a saga of inevitable destruction. Carthage had proven it could fight and win, but the psychological damage was done. They had tasted the terror of vulnerability. Rome, though defeated, immediately began building a new fleet, their fury only magnified by the humiliation. The First Punic War, fueled by the ancient oath of Hamilcar and the cold ambition of Rome, would not end until the very last ship was sunk and the very last coin was spent. The Corvus had introduced the game, but the African soil had tasted blood, and the horror was only just beginning to truly unfold. The horror was only just beginning to truly unfold, and the vast, shimmering coffers of the great harbor were starting to look painfully empty. Rome, that brutal, relentless machine, had tasted victory at sea, and the introduction of the Corvus was more than just a tactical advantage. It was a psychological hammer blow. Carthage was staggering, clutching at the wounds left by the massive boarding ramps, realizing that their mastery of the waves, their birthright, was being violently snatched away by landlubbers who suddenly learned how to fight on water. The Senate, paralyzed by political infighting and the terrifying reports of sunken fleets, could barely breathe. Every day brought news of another Sicilian town falling, another tributary drying up, another agonizing calculation of how many mercenaries they could still afford to throw into the meat grinder. This was not war. This was economic strangulation masked by violence, and the great merchant republic was choking on its own gold. The war in Sicily had become a festering wound, a slow, agonizing drain of men and resources, where Roman legions, though often outmaneuvered, could simply replenish their numbers indefinitely. Carthage had the tactical brilliance, yes, but Rome had the grim, terrifying calculus of endless human reserves. They desperately needed a new kind of terror, a shadow that could strike where the legions felt safest, a master strategist who understood that this war could not be won by simply sinking ships, but by breaking the will of the Senate in Rome itself. The conventional generals had failed, predictable and easily counteracted by the sheer, crushing mass of the enemy. And then, from the dust and the despair, a legend was forged, not in the marble halls of the Senate, but in the brutal, unforgiving hills of Eryx. His name was Hamilcar Barca, and the moment he took command in 247 BC, the entire tempo of the war shifted, like a sudden, violent crack of thunder over the Mediterranean. He was not like the perfumed generals of the Carthaginian elite. He was fire given form, a brilliant, terrifying master of ambush and improvisation. He arrived in Sicily not with the pomp of a great army, but with the ruthless efficiency of a surgeon preparing a painful, life-saving operation. The Romans had controlled the plains and the ports, feeling secure in their fortified camps. Hamilcar looked at the craggy cliffs, the dense forests, and the treacherous paths of western Sicily, and he didn't see obstacles. He saw his fortress, his natural weapon against the heavy infantry of the Republic. He established an impregnable base on Mount Eryx, a vertical terror that allowed him to strike like a viper and vanish before the legions could even muster a response. The legions hunting him found themselves constantly lured into traps, ambushed on narrow passes, and subjected to a campaign of psychological warfare designed to shred their morale piece by piece. He used small, highly mobile forces, utilizing the deadly precision of Numidian cavalry and light infantry with devastating effect, transforming the war from a slugfest into a deadly, asymmetrical dance. They called him Barca, the lightning, because his strikes were instantaneous, impossible to anticipate, and utterly devastating. Rome had never encountered a general who fought like this. They expected formations, predictable maneuvers, siege warfare. Hamilcar gave them ghosts and nightmares that stalked the Sicilian night, destroying supply lines and massacring foraging parties with surgical precision. For 6 agonizing years, Hamilcar held the line, preventing Rome from achieving total victory in Sicily, yet unable to push them completely off the island. It was a perfect, brutal stalemate, a war of attrition fought not just with spears, but with gold, a draining contest of wills that crippled both empires equally. The Carthaginian treasury, already ravaged by the loss of their massive grain shipments and the expense of replacing sunken fleets, was stretched to the breaking point, supporting this mountain fortress. But Rome was also suffering, their citizenry weary of endless taxes and the constant sight of crippled veterans returning home. The sheer cost of maintaining the siege lines around Hamilcar's strongholds was astronomical, forcing the Roman Senate to mortgage its future and push its Italian allies to the limits of endurance, creating dangerous internal resentment. The Roman people, the farmers and the merchants, not the state, finally decided enough was enough. In a staggering display of communal will, private citizens and wealthy equites pooled their resources, defying the exhausted public treasury, to fund one last massive fleet. This was the true moment of destiny. A privately financed armada of 200 ships, built with the sweat and desperation of the Roman populace, designed to finally cut off Hamilcar's supply lines and end the Sicilian deadlock forever. It was a gamble fueled by pure, desperate faith in the Republic. Carthage knew this push was coming. They knew that if Rome could control the seas around Sicily again, Hamilcar's glorious mountain campaign would collapse into starvation and surrender. They had to intercept. The resulting confrontation, the Battle of the Agates Islands in 241 BC, was not just a naval engagement. It was the final, desperate coin toss of the First Punic War. The Carthaginian relief fleet, hastily assembled, carrying crucial supplies and manned by raw, exhausted crews, was the last hope of the empire. Against them sailed the refined, professionally trained sailors of the new Roman fleet, hardened by years of war and driven by the savage fury of their citizens' investment. The clash was swift, brutal, and utterly decisive. The inexperienced Carthaginian captains, burdened by their cargo and outmaneuvered by the focused Roman attack, were routed. The sea boiled with burning timber and the screams of dying men. The corvus, though perhaps less prevalent, was irrelevant. The superior training and determination of the Romans won the day. Carthage lost the battle, and in losing the battle, they lost the war. The treaty that followed was not merely punitive, it was designed to permanently cripple the great city. Carthage was forced to evacuate Sicily entirely, pay a crushing indemnity of 3,200 Euboic talents, and watch as Rome claimed the lucrative islands of Corsica and Sardinia shortly thereafter, capitalizing on a brutal mercenary revolt that Carthage could no longer afford to suppress. The First Punic War, the great clash over the Mediterranean, had concluded, but it was merely the opening act. Carthage was broken, humiliated, but not dead. And Hamilcar Barca, the general of the lightning, would carry the fiery, bitter seed of vengeance back to Africa, a personal oath that would define the next century of world history. The debt had been tallied, and the cost would be paid in blood. A promise forged deep within the heart of the Carthaginian wilderness, awaiting the rise of his son. Hamilcar Barca did not merely whisper a curse into the salt-laced winds near the ruins of Lilybaeum. He architected vengeance with the precision of a master builder and the ruthlessness of a high priest. He knew that the inevitable, final war against Rome could not be fought on the broken ruins of Sicily or the ravaged, politically unstable fields of Africa itself. No, the next crucible of power, the true forge of the anti-Roman machine, lay across the turbulent waters of the Pillars of Hercules, Iberia, the vast, mysterious land of silver and savage strength, waiting to be exploited. Hamilcar needed more than just soldiers. He needed an endless river of gleaming metal to hire them, and the complete loyalty of that resource's source, far beyond the reach of the weak Punic Senate. This was not mere colonial expansion aimed at balancing trade accounts. It was the construction of a sovereign, militarized state, shielded by immense mountain ranges and fueled by inexhaustible subterranean wealth. The Barcid dynasty carved out a domain so vast, so rich in resources, from the deep, shimmering veins of the Sierra Morena to the hardy Celtiberian tribesmen, that it quickly overshadowed the original, stagnant wealth of the Punic homeland. Carthage was focused on olive oil futures and complex trade tariffs. Hamilcar was focused only on the currency of conflict, pure, unalterated silver pouring from the earth. The Senate back in Carthage, led by the perpetually jealous and disastrously short-sighted faction of Hanno the Great, watched this meteoric rise with a corrosive mixture of fear and outright political spite. They saw not a desperately needed bulwark against inevitable Roman aggression, but a dangerously successful rival who dared to operate outside the established, comfortable lines of Punic mercantile law. Hamilcar financed his own war machine entirely, independent of the often corrupted treasury of the old city, transforming the Iberian Peninsula into a gigantic, weaponized factory pointed directly at the heart of Italy. And in the center of this newly forged domain, raised amidst the constant clash of steel and the scent of leather, dust, and blood, was the boy who embodied the terrible oath, Hannibal. He was barely 9 years old when his father abruptly dragged him from the comparatively safe harbor of the family estate and immersed him instantly in the brutal reality of a military command on campaign. Hamilcar did not waste time teaching him philosophy or the finer points of Phoenician literature. He taught him how to read the flickering fear in a skirmishing enemy's eyes, and, more critically, how to command unwavering, absolute loyalty from men hardened by the Iberian sun and relentless, brutal campaigning. The boy's education was the camp itself, a constant, moving classroom of strategic warfare. He learned complex logistics by watching the intricate movement of supply trains, military strategy by observing the nuanced deployment of lightning-fast Numidian cavalry, and extreme endurance by marching alongside the heavy infantry. He slept wrapped in his cloak on the hard earth, dined on the soldiers' meager rations without complaint, and was deliberately exposed to every form of hardship, forging a mind and body that would eventually become synonymous with military genius itself, a force of nature refined by hatred. Every sunset in the new capital, which Hamilcar proudly named Carthago Nova, New Carthage, was a reminder of the mission. Hamilcar ensured that his son understood the full, agonizing weight of the destruction Rome had inflicted, the humiliating, crushing terms of the treaty, the agony of the subsequent mercenary war that nearly destroyed the homeland, and the final, crushing, treacherous loss of Sardinia and Corsica. These were not merely ancient history lessons to be catalogued. They were vivid, agonizing prophecies of required vengeance that demanded immediate action. The father instilled in the son not just blind, youthful hatred, but a cold, calculating, strategic determination, a political imperative that superseded all traditional Punic concepts of trade and easy profit. The Barcids were no longer simply wealthy merchants seeking profitable harbors. They were now military sovereigns committed absolutely to a singular, non-negotiable goal: the complete annihilation and subsequent dismantling of the Roman Republic. This fundamental shift marked the real, irreversible turning point, leading directly to the Second Punic War, decades before the first official shot was even fired across the Mediterranean. Hamilcar tirelessly pushed his armies deep into the hostile Spanish interior, securing access to the richest, most bountiful silver mines, and ensuring that the Barcid coffers would never, ever run dry. He methodically built a vast, professional army, no longer relying solely on fickle, expensive mercenaries, but fully integrated with newly loyal Celtiberian and Lusitanian auxiliary troops who worshipped his name. This new army was a revelation, disciplined, massively diverse, and fiercely loyal only to the Barcid family name. It stood as an open, gleaming challenge to Rome, openly preparing for the colossal conflict that every commander on both sides knew was coming, even as diplomacy continued to stutter and stall across the political theater of the Mediterranean. Rome watched this aggressive, unprecedented expansion with growing, grudging unease, yet they were hesitant to directly challenge the Barcids in their fortified Spanish stronghold, having only just begun to recover from their own devastatingly costly victory in the First Punic War. They saw Hamilcar as a mere warlord, a stubborn nuisance, perhaps a predictable, isolated threat, confined harmlessly to the western edges of the known world. They failed, in a catastrophic and fatal miscalculation, to recognize the existential fire he had ignited in his young, intense son. Hannibal, now fully entering his teens, was not just silently observing. He was actively participating in command decisions. He served as a high-ranking staff officer, learning to manage incredibly complex battle formations and mastering the subtle art of reconnaissance. A silent, intense, brilliant student of the deadly game his father had perfected. He excelled in all necessary languages, speaking flawless Punic, fluent Greek, and the harsh Iberian dialects, allowing him unprecedented access, communication, and loyalty among the vast numbers of non-Punic troops, a tactical factor that would prove absolutely catastrophic for Rome later on. The moment Hamilcar tragically died, drowning during a siege, or perhaps ambushed by hostile tribes, the exact details lost to the political machinations of the era, the command passed swiftly, but temporarily, to Hannibal's trusted brother-in-law. Hasdrubal the Fair took up the mantle of leadership, immediately stabilizing the nascent Barcid Empire, and crucially solidifying the administrative establishment of Carthago Nova as the true center of future Punic power. Hasdrubal was primarily a diplomat and a strategic builder, cementing necessary alliances, greatly expanding the city's infrastructure, and giving the Barcid domain a critically important veneer of established legitimacy that Hamilcar's raw, rapid conquest often lacked. But everyone in the camp knew exactly who the true inheritor and instrument of vengeance was. Hannibal remained quietly by Hasdrubal's side, a constant dark shadow, absorbing the political finesse and diplomatic maneuvering alongside the military strategy, waiting patiently for the inevitable moment the torch of vengeance would finally be passed directly to him. The oath whispered by the sea was now a colossal, gleaming city of silver and steel in Spain, waiting only for the single signal to march, awaiting the moment the sun, now a hardened man, would look east across the vast sea and remember the eternal promise he had made upon the sacred altar of his father's undying hatred. The clock of destiny was relentlessly ticking, and Rome remained blissfully, lethally unaware of the coming storm, gathering strength in the high mountains of Iberia. He was barely 26, a terrifying prodigy forged in the heat of Iberian gold and Punic vengeance. Hannibal Barca, the living embodiment of his father Hamilcar's sacred, blood-soaked promise, now stood on the precipice of history, ready to shatter the Pax Romana and plunge the Mediterranean into an abyss of fire and grief. The oath he swore as a child, touching the smoking altar of Baal, was not just a political maneuver. It was a soul contract, demanding the total eradication of the republic that dared humiliate his homeland. This wasn't merely a war for territory. It was a divine reckoning, a family crusade against the unforgivable sin of Roman victory. In the sun-scorched camps of New Carthage, a force unlike any the world had seen was assembling. Not just disciplined Carthaginian regulars, though those were few, but a mosaic of hardened warriors drawn from the edges of the known world, bound by the promise of untold spoils and Hannibal's magnetic, lethal leadership. There were the swift, terrifying Numidian cavalry, riders without saddles, their horses trained to turn on a whisper, ready to flank and annihilate the slow-moving Roman legions. These were the ghosts of the desert, and they would be the first hint of doom the complacent Romans would ever see. The core of his infantry were the Spanish Celtiberians, men who fought with the terrifying Fulks, a curved, heavy blade designed not just to wound, but to dismember, and the chilling determination of those who knew how to die well, provided the price was high enough. Then came the Balearic slingers, capable of hurling lead shot with the velocity and impact of a small missile, shattering bone and spirit before the armies even met face to face. He had built a machine of annihilation, finely tuned and utterly devoted to the young general, whose eyes held the cold fire of destiny itself, a force numbering nearly 50,000 souls, ready to march into the jaws of the impossible. The most terrifying aspect of Hannibal's plan, the element that defied military logic and sanity, was the path he chose. Rome expected a naval battle. They anticipated a defensive skirmish in Sicily or a long, drawn-out siege in Spain, where their superior resources could grind down the Punic threat. They never, in their wildest, most paranoid dreams, expected the impossible. Hannibal was going to bypass the sea, bypass the fortified ports, and take the war directly to the Italian heartland by crossing the impassable, God-forsaken barrier of the mighty Alps. This was not a mere march. It was an act of sacrificial madness, a high-stakes gamble against nature itself, designed to shock the very foundations of the Roman state into collapse by appearing where they least expected him, emerging like a vengeful spirit from the north. He calculated every step, every ounce of grain, every spare leather shield. The sheer logistical nightmare of moving approximately 40,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and the infamous, terrifying secret weapon, the 24 war elephants, across peaks soaring thousands of feet into the icy stratosphere, was a puzzle only a genius or a lunatic could attempt to solve. These elephants, massive tanks of living terror, were not just weaponry, they were psychological warfare incarnate, symbols of Punic power designed to break the morale of men who had never seen such colossal beasts in battle, let alone emerging from a snowstorm. They had to be fed, warmed, and guided through treacherous mountain passes, where a single misstep meant a fall of thousands of feet to oblivion, all while navigating hostile Gallic tribes who viewed the Carthaginian army as invaders, not liberators. The timing was everything. He had to rush against the clock of the seasons, pushing his weary men through hostile territory to cross the highest passes before the late autumn snows made the journey truly impassable. Driven by the spectral presence of his dead father guiding every choice. Meanwhile, in the gilded halls and sprawling villas of Rome, the senators argued over grain shipments and minor political squabbles, enjoying the temporary peace secured by their victory in the last war. The prevailing wisdom was one of supreme arrogance. Carthage was crippled, defeated, reduced to a glorified trading post, unable to mount any serious threat. Their main concern was still naval dominance, not a land invasion from the north. They believed the Mediterranean was their bathtub, and any real threat would come by sea. The consuls elected for the year of the impending disaster, Publius Cornelius Scipio and Tiberius Sempronius Longus, were preparing their forces, yes, but their gaze was fixed squarely on Iberia and Sicily, expecting a predictable replay of the first conflict. They saw Carthage as a wound that had healed, not a vengeful beast coiled and ready to strike from an entirely unexpected direction. They completely underestimated the depth of the Punic resentment, mistaking exhaustion for submission, believing that mountains were their allies and the cold their impenetrable defense, trusting geography to do the work that vigilance should have demanded. This fatal misjudgment, this blinding hubris, would soon cost the Republic rivers of blood and bring it to the brink of total annihilation. The last orders were given, supplies were packed, ropes checked, and the sacrificial fires burned brightly one last time. Hannibal, standing on the Iberian coast, looked north toward the hidden, snow-capped giants that guarded Italy, ready to sacrifice half his army just for the chance to fight. He wasn't just invading. He was performing an act of geographical defiance, rewriting the rules of warfare through sheer, unrelenting will. The storm was about to break. He was moving not as a general, but as an executioner, carrying the heavy burden of an entire civilization's destiny, ready to fulfill an ancient, terrible promise and bring the world of Rome crashing down around its arrogant ears. The die was cast, and a journey toward the bloody fields of Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae had officially begun. The world held its breath, but Rome, blinded by its own burgeoning might, hadn't even heard the whisper of the terrible vow taken by the boy beneath the bloody stars of Baal. Hannibal Barca, now a man forged in the fires of Iberian conquest, carried that oath not just as a duty, but as a living, breathing entity demanding vengeance, an ancestral debt that could only be paid in the currency of Roman blood. Every single day was a strategic calculation aimed at the destruction of the Roman system, a slow-motion catastrophe that Carthage itself was barely ready to handle, yet was destined to fund. The Iberian Peninsula, or Hispania, as the Romans would later call it, was the colossal engine powering this war machine, a new empire carved out of sheer will by the Barcid family. It was there headquartered in the gleaming new city of Carthage, New Carthage, that Hannibal meticulously assembled the most feared, most diverse, and frankly, most improbable fighting force the ancient world had ever witnessed, a true tapestry of controlled chaos. This wasn't merely a Carthaginian army. It was a devastating kaleidoscope of violence. The steadfast Libyan heavy infantry, swift Numidian cavalry, whose horses knew no saddle but the bare back, Balearic slingers who could shatter bone at 300 yards, and hardened Celtiberian mercenaries who fought with the terrifying zeal of the recently converted, all bound by the singular genius of their commander. The logistics alone were an unimaginable horror show, a bureaucratic nightmare wrapped in a military. The logistics alone were an unimaginable horror show, a bureaucratic nightmare wrapped in a military uniform, feeding and equipping tens of thousands of men, integrating disparate languages and centuries-old tribal loyalties, and maintaining the chain of command across such a massive, moving entity required a genius that bordered on the supernatural, a logistical mastery rarely seen before Alexander the Great. And then there were the beasts, the living, breathing, colossal tanks of the ancient world, the African war elephants, massive shadows of destruction that struck primal, paralyzing fear into the hearts of any who faced them, and required specialized handling, feeding, and transportation that defied all conventional military wisdom. Hannibal understood that a direct naval assault was suicide. Rome's control of the Mediterranean Sea, cemented after the crushing defeat of the First Punic War, was absolute and unchallenged. The only path to salvation, the only way to strike the heart of the enemy and sever its growing limbs, was the impossible path, a land invasion across terrain no army of this magnitude had ever attempted, let alone survived. His plan was madness, pure and simple, a magnificent, glorious delusion. But it was a calculated madness, built on the bedrock of tactical superiority and the conviction that Rome was soft at its core, ready to crumble the moment a true existential danger appeared unexpectedly on its doorstep. The signal was given, an order that reverberated through the mercenary camps and across the sprawling Iberian plains in the late spring of 218 BC, launching an expeditionary force of approximately 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry toward their destiny. They were not just marching against Roman legions, they were marching against geography, against nature itself, against the very concept of limits that bound lesser men. The first major hurdle, the formidable Pyrenees Mountains, was a brutal introduction to the campaign's true difficulty. It wasn't the Roman scouts that caused the first catastrophic losses. It was the sheer difficulty of passage, the harsh terrain, and the chilling realization among the Iberian troops that they were leaving their homeland forever to fight a shadowy foe across distant seas, never to return. Hannibal had to employ a frightening mix of ruthless discipline and charismatic reassurance, sending thousands of unwilling or wavering soldiers back home to secure the loyalty of the remainder and thin the ranks of the doubtful, ensuring that only the truly committed or the desperately loyal continued. Every man who continued was a fanatic, loyal to the Barcid family, or utterly terrified of the alternative fate that awaited them if they deserted. Now they were in Gaul, an immense, hostile territory populated by savage Gallic tribes who were either cunningly bribed into temporary, unstable cooperation or crushed swiftly underfoot by the terrifying advance of the Carthaginian vanguard. The next monumental task loomed like a dark specter: the mighty, swift-moving Rhone River, a colossal watery obstacle that needed to be breached immediately. How do you move an army of perhaps 50,000 battle-hardened men, 9,000 swift cavalry, and 36 massive, terrified elephants across a treacherous, ice-fed river, while hostile, unpredictable tribes watched from the northern banks, ready to pounce on any sign of weakness? Hannibal's engineering brilliance shone through the chaos, a light in the logistical darkness. Using massive, specially constructed rafts, some covered in earth and disguised as solid ground to trick the nervous, wary elephants into stepping onto them, and employing simultaneous diversionary tactics upriver to confuse the waiting Gauls, he managed the colossal, death-defying feat. The sight of the elephants struggling, terrified and panicking as the rafts broke up, some drowning and being dragged back to shore by their desperate handlers, was a horrifying spectacle that underscored the utter desperation of this existential campaign. They survived the Rhone, but the Alps waited, a truly insurmountable barrier of rock and ice, a geological behemoth designed by nature to be the graveyard of empires. No general in their right mind, especially one leading African and Mediterranean troops who had never seen real cold, would attempt this suicidal crossing. The Romans, confidently preparing defenses in Sicily and Massilia, modern Marseille, never once considered that the threat would come screaming down from the heavens, descending from the peaks like a vengeful thunderbolt. Hannibal chose a path shrouded in historical mystery, likely the treacherous Col de la Traversette, or possibly the Col du Clapier, routes known for their brutal elevation and sudden, murderous, unpredictable weather shifts that could kill an entire cohort in minutes. The dangers weren't just the altitude and the accumulating ice. The fierce mountain tribes, known as Gauls or Celts, saw the passing army as a slow-moving jackpot of plunder and riches, raining down arrows, stones, and entire boulders from high vantage points, forcing the Carthaginians to fight agonizing uphill battles while trying to maintain tight formation on slick, crumbling precipices. The sheer exhaustion began to break the morale of the multinational force, fraying the bonds of the mercenary loyalties. Men slipped and fell thousands of feet into icy chasms, their screams swallowed by the swirling wind. The narrow paths meant that one misstep by a pack animal or an elephant could send dozens of men tumbling to their deaths below. Supplies dwindled rapidly, and the only source of genuine, driving warmth was the desperate, unifying need to keep moving forward, away from the misery behind them. Each brutal night, the bitter, bone-cracking cold claimed more lives than the skirmishes with the predatory tribes. Yet Hannibal pushed them. His presence, his unwavering gaze, and his shared suffering were the only things holding the fragile, multinational coalition together against the total collapse of discipline and will. They crawled toward the summit, a pinnacle of agonizing human endurance and stubborn defiance. When they finally broke through the perpetual clouds and looked down upon the promised land, the rich, green, fertile plains of northern Italy, the sight was supposed to inspire them to one last burst of energy. But what they saw was an army decimated, shattered, and bleeding out, a ghost of the force that had left Iberia months prior. The terrible descent was yet to come, and the real war, the apocalyptic confrontation with the vengeful Roman Republic, was about to begin on a freezing, rain-swept plain, a battleground chosen by destiny.